It was August 12th, and the camp had fallen into its usual evening routine. The fire crackled softly as the last of the kids had gone to bed, leaving the counselors to enjoy the stillness of the night. That's when I saw it for the first time. The hooded figure standing across the lake, illuminated by the flickering light of a distant campfire. At first, I thought it was just another camper from a nearby site, but something felt off. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself I was imagining things. But the next night, the figure was there again, closer this time. The air was cooler, the wind carrying the faint rustling of leaves through the trees. The campfire cast eerie shadows that danced across the trees, but the figure remained still, just out of reach. My stomach knotted with anxiety as I stared, unsure if I should mention it to the others or keep it to myself. The following day passed in a blur of activities, and I nearly forgot about the figure. But as darkness fell, the unease returned. That night, I couldn't resist checking the spot where I had seen the figure. Sure enough, there it was. Only this time, it was even closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched, trying to convince myself that it was just a coincidence. Yet the more I looked, the more certain I became that this stranger was watching me, specifically. I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every gust of wind outside my tent sent a jolt of fear through me. The figure haunted my thoughts, and by morning, I was determined to find out who or what was lurking near our camp. But part of me was terrified of what I might discover. The next evening, I made up my mind. I would keep watch and finally confront whoever or whatever was lurking near the neighboring campsite. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the camp, I felt a growing sense of dread. The fire was lit, and my fellow counselors gathered around, chatting and laughing. But I couldn't focus on their conversations. My eyes kept drifting to the woods, where I had seen the figure before. I knew it would return. When the fire died down and the night was fully upon us, I slipped away from the group, under the guise of a short walk. I headed toward the spot where I had seen the hooded figure. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the soft crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound as I moved through the darkness. Then, just as I approached the clearing, there it was. The figure, standing unnervingly still, as though waiting for me. I froze. My mouth went dry, and my heart raced. I wanted to call out, to demand to know who they were, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I edged closer, trying to make out any details in the dim light. The figure's face was obscured by the hood, its body hunched, as if hiding something. I took another cautious step forward, but before I could get any closer, the figure bolted into the woods, vanishing between the trees without a sound. My breath caught in my throat as I stumbled backward, torn between chasing after it and running back to the safety of camp. My curiosity won out, and I followed the path it had taken. The woods felt darker now, more foreboding. The wind had picked up, howling through the branches like a distant cry. Every rustle in the underbrush sent my nerves into overdrive, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know who was haunting our camp. The trail led deeper into the forest, where the trees thickened, and the light of the campfire was a distant memory. I called out, my voice trembling in the night air, but no one answered. Just when I was about to turn back, I saw something glinting on the ground ahead, a small, silver object half buried in the dirt. I knelt down and picked it up, realizing it was an old, tarnished locket. My fingers trembled as I opened it, revealing a faded photograph inside. A shiver ran down my spine. The photo showed a young woman with hauntingly familiar eyes, and beneath it, a name etched in tiny letters, Emily. My heart raced as I stared at the locket. The name Emily echoed in my mind, though I didn't know why. I pocketed the locket and scanned the trees around me. The figure was gone, but I had a feeling this locket was connected to whoever had been lurking around the camp. I made my way back to the campsite, trying to piece together the fragments of my thoughts. The forest seemed to close in around me, the once familiar woods now eerie and unwelcoming. That night, sleep eluded me once again. I lay in my tent, clutching the locket and thinking about the woman in the photograph. Who was she? What connection did she have to this strange figure? My mind raced through endless possibilities. An old camper, a lost hiker, a ghost perhaps? The more I thought about it, the more the fear and intrigue twisted together inside me. Was the figure simply trying to scare us? Or was there something more? The next day, I discreetly asked around camp if anyone knew about an Emily who might have been a camper or hiker in these woods. But no one had any answers. The counselors thought I was being paranoid, and I couldn't blame them. The whole story sounded ridiculous when I said it out loud. A mysterious figure, a lost locket, a faded photo. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, that this person, whoever they were, needed help. That evening, I returned to the spot where I'd found the locket. This time, I wasn't alone. I took a flashlight and a map, determined to follow the trail deeper into the woods. As I ventured further into the forest, the shadows grew longer, the trees twisting in the faint moonlight. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the forest itself was trying to swallow me whole. Just when I was about to turn back, I heard it, a soft, faint voice carried on the wind. It called my name. The voice sent chills through my body. It was soft, almost pleading, as it whispered my name again. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the trees, but there was no one in sight. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a few hesitant steps forward, the voice growing slightly louder. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky and uncertain. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the voice spoke again, this time clearer. "Please, help me." I felt a pull in my chest, a desperate urge to find the source of the voice. It sounded so close, yet I couldn't see anyone. I followed the sound through the trees, the darkness seeming to press in on all sides. The flashlight beam wavered as my hand shook, the woods around me feeling more suffocating with each step. Finally, I emerged into a small clearing. At the center stood a figure, no longer hooded, but now visible in the dim light of the moon. It was a young woman, her face pale and drawn, eyes filled with sorrow. She looked just like the woman in the locket. "Emily?" I whispered, disbelief and fear twisting inside me. She nodded slowly, her eyes locking onto mine with a mixture of desperation and relief. "I've been lost for so long," she murmured. "I need to go home." My mind raced, struggling to understand what was happening. Was she a ghost? A spirit trapped in these woods? The air around us felt heavy, thick with an otherworldly presence. Without thinking, I reached out and took her hand. Her skin was cold to the touch, but solid, real. She smiled faintly, and in that moment, I knew I had to help her. Together, We walked through the woods, her steps becoming stronger as we neared the edge of the camp. The night seemed to lighten as we moved, the oppressive feeling lifting. When we finally reached the camp's boundary, she turned to me, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. And just like that, she was gone. Vanished into the night, leaving only the locket in my hand as proof of our encounter. I stood there, staring at the empty space where she had been, my mind swirling with disbelief. But deep down, I felt a sense of peace. Emily had found her way home, wherever that was. And somehow, I knew that I had been part of something far bigger than I could ever understand. The fear that had once gripped me was gone, replaced by a strange calm. As I walked back to the camp, I couldn't help but smile, knowing that whatever darkness had lingered in these woods was now gone. It was September 7th, and the air around the lake was cool as the last remnants of summer began to fade. The camp was quieter than usual. Only a few tents remained occupied as the season wound down. I was lying in my sleeping bag, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper coming from the tent next to mine. At first, I thought it was one of the other campers talking in their sleep. But the voice was too low, too steady. The whispering continued, growing slightly louder, but I couldn't make out the words. It was strange, almost hypnotic, and it seemed to wrap around me like the mist that hung over the lake. I lay still, straining to listen, trying to decipher the words. My heart quickened as a chill crawled up my spine. Something about it felt wrong, as if the voice wasn't meant for human ears. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest. The next day, I asked the other campers if they had heard anything unusual the night before, but they all shrugged it off. "Probably just the wind," one of them said with a dismissive smile. But I knew it wasn't the wind. The voice had been too clear, too deliberate. As the day wore on, I found myself becoming more and more fixated on the memory of that whisper, wondering if I had imagined it, or if something more sinister was at play. That night, I lay awake in my tent, waiting. The campfire had burned down to embers, and the night was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then, just as I was beginning to doze off, I heard it again. The same low, haunting whisper, this time closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, trying to ignore the rising sense of dread that was creeping through me. The whispers were more distinct now, but still too soft for me to understand. All I knew was that they weren't stopping. The next night, I found myself dreading the darkness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The whispers had been louder the night before, and though I still couldn't make out the words, I had begun to feel like they were directed at me, like they were trying to tell me something. The others didn't seem to notice anything unusual, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. What were those whispers saying? I lay awake, eyes wide open as the hours passed. Midnight came and went, the camp completely still, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe the whispers wouldn't return. But just as I began to relax, I heard them again. Soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but then growing louder, more urgent. This time, I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to hear. The voice was clearer now, though still fragmented, like a broken radio signal. "Come closer," it seemed to say. "Come closer." A shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend that I hadn't heard anything, but the voice kept pulling me in. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside, the cool night air prickling my skin. The whispers grew louder as I approached the neighboring tent, but when I peeked inside, it was empty. My breath caught in my throat. The tent had been occupied the night before, but now there was no sign of anyone. Only the whispering remained, echoing faintly in the air around me. I felt my heart race as I backed away, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was experiencing. Why would the tent be empty? And where were the whispers coming from if no one was inside? The air felt thick with something I couldn't explain, an invisible presence that seemed to be watching, waiting. My hands shook as I returned to my tent, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave. But the whispers followed me, and I knew that whatever was happening wasn't over yet. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. The memory of the whispers haunted me, weaving through every thought, every conversation. I felt like I was walking in a fog, barely able to keep track of time. The others at camp seemed oblivious, laughing and joking as though nothing was wrong. But I knew better. Something was happening, something that none of us could see, something that was pulling me deeper into its grasp. That night, as the darkness swallowed the camp once again, I braced myself. I knew the whispers would come back, and this time, I wasn't sure I would be able to ignore them. I lay in my tent, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline, my heart pounding in my chest. Minutes stretched into hours, and just when I thought maybe, just maybe, the night would be quiet, the whispers returned, louder, clearer. "Come closer," they urged. "We are waiting." Fear gripped me, but curiosity tugged at me just as strongly. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside into the cool night air. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the camp. The whispers were everywhere now, wrapping around me like a blanket, pulling me toward the empty tent. My hands shook as I approached, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what was inside. I knelt down and unzipped the flap, holding my breath as I peered inside. The tent was still empty, but this time, something else was there. In the center of the floor was a small notebook, its pages worn and yellowed with age. My fingers trembled as I reached for it, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. I opened the notebook and saw that it was filled with strange symbols, lines and shapes that made no sense. But as I flipped through the pages, I realized there were words hidden among the symbols. The same phrase repeated over and over. "Come closer." The words "come closer" seemed to pulse off the pages, as though the notebook itself was alive. My hands trembled as I held it, every instinct telling me to drop it and run. But the whispers were louder now, almost deafening, urging me to keep going. I felt trapped, like I was sinking deeper into a place I couldn't escape. The symbols on the pages blurred together, twisting and writhing like they were trying to form something new, something I wasn't meant to see. Suddenly, the wind picked up, swirling around the camp with a force that sent shivers down my spine. I stood up, clutching the notebook to my chest as the world around me seemed to shift. The whispers were no longer coming from the tent. They were coming from everywhere, surrounding me, closing in. I stumbled back, my mind spinning as the air grew colder and the night darker. It was as if the camp had been swallowed by something unseen, Something I couldn't comprehend. I don't know what made me do it, but I dropped the notebook. The moment it hit the ground, the wind stopped. The whispers faded into silence, leaving the night eerily still. I stood there, breathless, waiting for something to happen, for the whispers to return, for the world to snap back into place. But nothing did. The camp was silent, the tent empty, and the notebook lay at my feet, harmless once more. I bent down to pick it up, but it had vanished. I blinked in disbelief, searching the ground, but there was no sign of it. The only thing that remained was the lingering sense of unease, the feeling that something had been taken from me that I could never get back. I glanced around the camp, half expecting the whispers to start again, but they didn't. The night was quiet. Too quiet. I never told anyone what happened that night. I left the camp the next morning, my thoughts heavy with questions I knew would never be answered. The whispers had stopped, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I swear I can still hear them. Faint, but unmistakable. Come closer. It was October 3rd, and the campgrounds were nearly empty. The air had grown colder, the vibrant colors of fall slowly fading into the brown hues of late autumn. I had been assigned to the more secluded side of the camp, near the edge of the forest, where only a few campers remained. That's when I first met him, Ben. He was quiet, a bit withdrawn, always sitting alone by the fire while the other campers talked and laughed. Something about him seemed off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I introduced myself, trying to make small talk, but Ben barely responded. He just stared into the flames, his face expressionless, like he was lost in some distant memory. I sat with him for a while, hoping he would open up, but the silence stretched between us like a wall I couldn't break. Eventually, I gave up and left him there, feeling a strange sense of unease that lingered long after I walked away. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The wind rustled through the trees, making the shadows dance in strange, unsettling patterns. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about Ben, his empty stare, his quiet presence. I wondered what had brought him to the camp, why he seemed so disconnected from the world around him. Something about him made me feel uneasy, like he was hiding something. The next day, I tried talking to Ben again. This time, he seemed a bit more willing to engage, though his words were slow and measured. He told me he'd been coming to this camp for years, but this was the first time he had come alone. There was a sadness in his voice, a heaviness that weighed down every sentence. He spoke of the woods, how he felt drawn to them, how he sometimes saw things in the trees that no one else could see. I didn't know what to make of it at the time, but a chill crept over me as he spoke, and for a moment, I almost believed him. As the days passed, Ben's behavior grew stranger. He started spending more time alone, wandering deeper into the woods during the day, and sitting silently by the fire at night. When I asked him about it, he would just shrug and say he needed to be out there, that there were things in the trees that called to him. His words sent a shiver down my spine, but I dismissed them as nothing more than imagination. Still, something about the way he said it felt real, like he truly believed what he was saying. One night, as we sat by the fire, Ben began telling me stories about the woods and the strange things he had seen. He spoke of shadowy figures moving between the trees, of eyes watching him from the darkness. "They're waiting," he whispered, his voice low and hollow. "They're always waiting." I tried to laugh it off, but the intensity in his eyes made it hard to dismiss his words. I could see the fear in his expression, the way his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. That night, I lay awake in my tent, my mind racing with Ben's stories. I couldn't help but think about the things he had seen, the figures lurking in the woods. The camp was quiet, but the wind howled through the trees like a distant wail. I listened intently, half expecting to hear something out of the ordinary. Footsteps, whispers, anything. But the only sound was the wind and the crackling of the dying fire outside. Still, the uneasy feeling remained. The next morning, Ben was even quieter than usual. He barely said a word as he packed up his things and headed into the woods, not bothering to explain where he was going or when he would be back. I watched him disappear into the trees, a growing sense of dread gnawing at my stomach. Something was wrong. I could feel it, but I didn't know what to do. Should I follow him? Or should I leave him to his strange solitude? Ben didn't come back that night. I stayed up, waiting by the fire long after the other campers had gone to bed. The woods felt different, darker, more oppressive. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it an uneasy silence. Every now and then, I would glance toward the tree line, half expecting to see Ben emerge from the shadows, but he never did. My anxiety grew with every passing hour, the knot in my stomach tightening as the night dragged on. By morning, I knew something was wrong. I gathered a few of the other counselors and explained the situation. Together, we searched the woods, calling Ben's name, hoping he had simply wandered off and gotten lost. But there was no sign of him, no footprints, no broken branches, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. My chest tightened with fear as we scoured the forest, my mind racing with possibilities. What if something had happened to him? What if the things he had seen in the woods were real? Hours passed, and the search turned up nothing. The other counselors began to lose hope, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Ben was still out there, somewhere. His stories kept replaying in my mind, the way he had spoken about the figures in the woods, the things only he could see. I started to wonder if there was something more to his disappearance, something beyond what any of us could understand. The thought sent a chill through me, but I couldn't ignore it. That night, as I sat by the fire alone, I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. I had dismissed Ben's stories as nothing more than strange imaginings, but now I wasn't so sure. The woods felt alive with an unseen presence, something that lurked just beyond the edge of my perception. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I couldn't help but feel like I had failed Ben, that maybe if I had listened to him, things would have been different. The fire crackled weakly as I sat there, staring into the flames. The warmth did little to calm the growing chill in my bones, a chill that had less to do with the cold air and more with the creeping sense of dread that had taken root deep inside me. Ben was still missing, and despite the efforts of the counselors and campers to keep things normal, there was an undeniable tension hanging over the camp. The once peaceful atmosphere had shifted, replaced by a thick, suffocating unease. It was as if the woods themselves had become darker, more dangerous. As I sat alone by the fire, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it faint, indistinct sounds that set my nerves on edge. Every so often, I thought I heard my name, soft and distant, carried on the breeze like a memory. I knew it wasn't real, but the more I listened, the more certain I became that something was out there, watching, waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my flashlight, I rose from the fire and made my way toward the woods. The other counselors would have told me not to go, that it wasn't safe, that Ben was probably gone, but I couldn't sit still. I needed answers. I needed to find him. The trees loomed tall and dark as I stepped into the forest, their branches reaching out like twisted arms, blocking out the moonlight. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but it did little to dispel the feeling that I was being watched. I followed the path Ben had taken the day he disappeared, my heart pounding in my chest with each step. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed to change, growing colder and heavier, almost suffocating. The forest felt alive, its presence pressing down on me from all sides. Every sound, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the creak of branches in the wind, echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness, amplifying my fear. I called out for Ben, my voice shaky and uncertain, but only silence answered. I pushed further into the woods, the flashlight beam flickering as I moved through the underbrush. Then, just as I was about to give up, I saw something in the distance, a faint, flickering light, like a candle burning in the darkness. My pulse quickened as I hurried toward it, my breath catching in my throat. The light seemed to grow brighter as I approached, guiding me deeper into the forest. When I finally reached the source of the light, I stopped dead in my tracks. In the middle of a small clearing sat a single tent, Ben's tent. But it was different, older somehow, as if it had been sitting there for years. The light was coming from inside the tent, casting strange shadows that flickered and danced across the fabric. My hand trembled as I reached for the zipper, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I had come this far. I had to know what had happened. I unzipped the tent slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Inside, the light was dim, flickering like a dying flame. And there, sitting in the middle of the tent, was Ben. He was hunched over, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and distant. He didn't look up as I entered, didn't seem to notice me at all. My breath caught in my throat as I knelt beside him, reaching out a hand to touch his shoulder. His skin was cold, too cold, and as my fingers brushed against him, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness wash over me. "Ben," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "What happened to you?" He didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward me, his eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, a brief flash of the old Ben I had known. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Only a soft, choking gasp that sent a chill down my spine. And then, just like that, the light went out. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the darkness closed in around me. When I looked again, Ben was gone, vanished into the night, leaving nothing behind but the cold, empty tent. I stood there for what felt like hours, the silence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't escape. I knew then that Ben was never coming back. Whatever had taken him, whatever had drawn him into the woods, it had taken him for good. I left the camp the next morning, unable to shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. And sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees I can still hear him, faint and distant, calling my name.